One of the really striking things about the film is obviously the really clever play and merging of documentary and fiction, and your background is in documentary films. So can you talk a little bit about bridging that gap between nonfiction and traditional narrative filmmaking?
I think I didn't know when I first sort of found the story and when I first started getting into the whole, I guess, doing a bit more. I read about the story in a magazine and I thought, this is a really bizarre and kind of fun yarn. But I didn't necessarily, at that point, I didn't really know it was anything more than that. I kind of thought, it's just a great, it sort of felt already like the plot to a movie, but there was something about it that didn't really quite add up, and that was the why of it. The fact that the more I read about it, the more improbable it all seemed, that they would ever have thought that they were going to get away with it, that the fact that they were educated and privileged and from good homes, and I just couldn't quite figure out that, nothing that I read seemed to come close to answering it. And so we made contact with the real guys who by that time were in a long way into a deep sort of prison sentence, and just sort of started, writing to them and saying, can you help me understand a bit more of what you were thinking? And they had a fair bit of time on their hands, and so they were willing to they started writing these letters, and the things that came back in these letters were the thing that took it from a fun story and a good yarn to actually, maybe this is really a story of our time, and something that felt more relevant. And it was their voices and their reasons behind, such as Spencer talking about dreaming of becoming an artist and feeling that the one thing that all great artists had that he didn't was suffering and tragedy and drama and all of this. And, the idea of a central protagonist whose main problem is that he doesn't have a problem felt like a very modern idea, and also a great starting point, and also kind of reflective of not just that generation, but kind of where we're going culturally as well, a little bit, this need to be a somebody.
I mean, it seems kind of almost radical to be making a film about very privileged white guys.
Yeah, it's not really the moment, as it turns
or
out.
Or it's exactly the
I
moment.
would argue that it is, but it's such a funny time, particularly in the States. I think people don't realize that it's part of the same conversation.
Absolutely.
And it felt, because, without wanting to get into too much of that, these are the guys with the privilege and the opportunity, and they're not worried about the equilibrium. They're worried about whether they're going to be remembered for something. They're worried about whether they're going to be a somebody. And I think that was what made me think, well, there's a way of, we still get to deliver on the things we all want from a heist movie, and that will be fun. But also, smuggled into that is this conversation about this, this culture. And I was interviewed by a journalist in Seattle, a college journalist recently, and she said, she was of this kind of age, and she said it hit home for her and her friends so powerfully because they're all thinking, what am I going to write about, and what have I got to say? And if I don't have a Wikipedia page written about me by the time I'm 40, will that mean that I'm not a success? And, I think that all was part of what was driving the crime. And so there's a very long way of answering your question, which is, I felt without their voices in it, it was going to be a much more disposable story. And I thought, maybe there's a new way of telling a true story we haven't quite seen, which isn't that based on a true story at the beginning, and then we see the photos of the real people at the end, and then you go and Google furiously,
And can you talk a little bit about the process behind it? So, you reached out to them, you interviewed them.
Yeah.
Did you then start kind of crafting a script based on that?
Totally, yeah. It was a really, it wasn't an easy process, because to get your film finance, you have to write a screenplay, and of course the screenplay I was writing was based on all of the things that they would put in their letters from prison, and I imagined that if they'd said it on paper, they would say a version of it when we finally came to shoot these interviews, and of course, so I wrote the script with what I expected them to say, and of course on the day they didn't say any of that. They some of them clammed up, some of them, it suddenly became they suddenly were aware that, oh, we're bringing this whole story back up, and it was devastating for their parents. It was cataclysmic within the community, and they sort of went to bits a little bit. And so I kind of had to abandon, and the last thing you want to do with a documentary contributor is try and turn them into an actor or a performer and give them lines. And there was a point where I was thinking, oh God, I've sold this movie, and I'm kind of, because the production was sort of moving. I was going to shoot the non-fiction stuff, then I was going to go back and prep and shoot the fiction stuff. And I came out of those interviews and I kind of called the producer and I was like, I need to go and rewrite around not what I thought they were going to say, but what they've actually said. And some of it was better and deeper and more poignant, and some of it was just different. And so there wasn't a template for any of it, and it was ambitious even, but it was, and I got the sense that there were, probably rumblings amongst the people involved that, maybe if he fucks all that up, then at least we'll still have the fiction version and we can take all the doc stuff out. But I was very much like Warren, you're either in or you're out. This is how it's going to be, and hopefully it'll work,
And how did you balance kind of the performers, so the actors that you were working in for the fictional part of it, and their relationship as well with the real counterparts? Like, did you ever allow them to meet or get inspired by it, or did you want to?
It was controversial, that, because they're all great actors, and of course, if you're playing a real person, you're going to want to spend time with them, because and there's no better way of getting to I guess the nuts and bolts of who they are. But I felt quite strongly that I didn't want that. I didn't want them to, because partly the real guys are now 12 years older than when it happened. Majority of that time they were in prison. They're very different people from who they were. And I also felt like I had distilled as much as I understood of who they were and what they were into the screenplay, and I really wanted that to be the kind of the template for the actors. And I wanted the actors liberated to find their own version of these characters. I didn't want them, because there's also a danger that, as you've seen, real Warren is very magnetic and charismatic, and if Evan sat down with him and Warren started saying to him, look, I didn't, don't make me out to be violent or too much of a dick or whatever it was, Evan would start to feel a kind of responsibility towards that person, and I just didn't think that was going to be helpful. But of course, Evan, who was channeling Warren, completely disobeyed me and reached out to Warren on Twitter, and they began this kind of secret correspondence, which I had to kind of put an end to. But I think in the end, they were all very relieved that I'd kind of allowed them to be completely, as I say, sort of liberated from having to feel like that. And I didn't want any imitations, and I didn't want them to be lookalikes. I just thought, it's up to you to find your version of this character and pour yourself into that, and not be worrying about, in my mind, it wasn't like real and actor version. It was like older version and younger version, in the way that, you see in a lot of movies, I guess.
And you mentioned Warren as an example, and I wanted to ask about him, because he's kind of, they're all fascinating in their own ways, but he kind of breaks through, especially towards the end, because so much of what he said had happened might not be true, and it's all maybe his fantasy or him misremembering, and we don't really know. And I'm genuinely curious, like, what's the real Warren like? Because I imagine the one that we see on screen and the one that Evan portrays are two different people from the one.
No, absolutely not. I mean, he is 100% that 100% of the time. I mean, he is a really, I wish you could, if he were here, you'd see he is a person who lives life at a high velocity and kind of doesn't see the barriers and doesn't see the limitations that most of us do, and that can obviously be positive in some ways and obviously quite negative in others. And he is, that whole sequence with the tattoo, that came out of, one of the first times I met him. He had these, that's only one of his bizarre tattoos, but I was like, oh, what have you got? And then he started kind of, like showing me and there was this brilliant moment where we were in this very public place and he was sort of stripping off to show me all of these daft tattoos that he was very proud of. You know, that it was kind of a fun joke, but not that funny that you'd have it tattooed on yourself for the rest of your life. And then so when that bit was filmed where he's showing it, that he didn't know the camera was rolling because he went to the loo and then he came back and I said to my DP, I was like, just roll the camera. And then I said, when he came out, I was like, Warren, before we sit down, just show Eric a couple of your tattoos, which he immediately gladly did. And that felt to me like the perfect way to kind of introduce him as a character. And you know, and I think in that moment you understand almost all you need to know about his approach to life. Yeah.
There's an element that I find really intriguing of kind of movie fantasy in the film, particularly because it is a really effective heist movie, but it plays around, and even they in the film kind of go to a blockbuster to research how to pull off a heist by watching heist movies. Was that kind of a knowing, more fictional kind of wink to the movie that you knew you were crafting, or was that something that they really genuinely did?
No, it's a great question. Yeah, no, it's something they genuinely did. And most of the movies that you see in that like stack are the ones that they mentioned that they had written. I mean, if they'd bothered to watch them to the end, they would have realized that it all ended fucking terribly, you know. So, the thing about it was that I think that was the thing they were in love with, right? Yeah. The fantasy. And Warren is this consummate kind of fantasy. You know, I mean, you know, he's studying filmmaking. He wants to live in a kind of movie reality and take everyone with him. And I think, you know, Eric said to me in one of the letters from prison, he said, you know, this was like our version of Fight Club, this secret that we had. He was like, it was this thing that we were doing and no one else knew about it, and it made us different and better than everyone else. And I think what happened was they fell in love with the bond that created and the project, and none of them really wanted to give it up. But also, I think, with the possible exception of Warren, none of them actually really thought they were ever going to go through with it. Definitely not Spencer or Eric or probably, you know, I think they just thought they'd go right up to the precipice and kind of look over and go, okay, we got here and now's enough. And they just crossed the line that shouldn't be crossed. And that, for me, was what the movie was about in a way. And I suppose, so you know, there are a lot of conscious references to movies, particularly the ones that they were inspired by, but also, you know, the idea of the form and the look and the structure and even the sound of the movie was that we start off in a place of relative kind of naturalism, and as they descend into the sort of movie fantasy, so the filmmaking becomes more movie-like in the sense of, you know, there's a couple of those scenes, like when he goes to Amsterdam to meet, you know, that was almost a movie within a movie. You know, if Warren did make it up, who would he cast in the role of the guy at the fence? You know, it had to be Udo Kier, right? So all of those things, and, you know, we shot those anamorphic and that's, you know, with a slightly different quality about them. And that right up until the point where the line gets crossed and you're thrown back into what feels more like reality, I guess.
And there's a really sudden tonal shift as well when that line, as you say, is crossed. So they kind of go, they look over the precipice and then they pull back and then they go back in again. And then everything changes, like the tone of the movie, the look of it almost.
Exactly, yeah.
And certainly, you know, at least for myself, the way that I perceive the characters up until that point, because we never really see them perpetrate anything.
Yeah.
They're just talking about it. Was that something that you mapped out from script stage?
Totally, and I think, you know, and it was described really sort of, even the way that, you know, I often pop into the movie at like that point of the heist, and we took a lot, you know, I took a lot of the color. You know, when you make a movie, you grade it and you give it a real beautiful quality. And at that point, I kind of removed most of that. And it's very hard to make your pictures deliberately look uglier. And I often come into the cinema at that point to check on the film, and I'm like, oh fuck, why did you do that? And I have to remind myself that was the intention, and it was even written into the script, that exact thing. And all, you know, that it felt like unless there was that real sharp shift from the fantasy into the reality of that line being crossed, it wouldn't work, and we would have missed the point, I guess.
And I was really impressed by the fact that you kind of kept the real librarian hidden. Kind of, she was not one of the talking heads until kind of until that moment. It almost felt like, was that by design, that you wanted to the audience to almost feel like maybe she didn't survive the incident?
Yeah, it was, I suppose, and I guess I mean I did a long interview with BJ, and she's great and super lovely and impressive, and there were a lot of things that she said which were very smart and insightful that I kind of toyed with putting in, but I actually thought, much better to not only to give her the last word, but also just to keep that, you're kind of asking, well, what actually happened? How bad did that get? And all the rest of it. She was probably the person that took the longest to convince. I mean, there are still parents who I would have liked to have been in the film who aren't in the film, of the, I guess, 8 parents, I think, there's only 4 of them. BJ, I think she just didn't quite understand what it was that, for a while, what was the reason for wanting to tell the story and all the rest of it. And then I think over time, and I went to visit her and spent time, looking at the actual books and with her and kind of, hanging out. And then I never showed any of them the script, but I explained to her, what I was trying to do, and eventually she came on board and agreed to do an interview. And I think she felt that the university hadn't really looked after her very well. They hadn't taken it seriously in the way they should have, because she was kind of physically okay. And then I showed her the movie before I showed it to anyone at Sundance. She was probably the only person. I wasn't going to give anyone any editorial control, least of all the real guys. But I thought I would do the courtesy of showing them all the movie before the rest of the world saw it. And so I took it to BJ's house and watched it with her husband, who fell asleep, and she got quietly hammered was drinking Cosmopolitans, and 15 cats were like walking around. I mean, that makes her sound more stereotypical librarian. She's not. She's pretty cool, and she loved it, and she clapped along to the soundtrack, and then afterwards asked to see it again, and then wrote me this email, which I'm sure she wouldn't mind me sharing, which was saying this is the first time she felt she can now begin to forgive them, because she sort of suddenly realized that they were probably idiots rather than criminals, and also found it a really cathartic thing. She felt like people were going to understand what she went through, and so I would have, if she hadn't been involved, I would have made sure, if we'd made it without her physically appearing on screen, I would have made sure that she saw it and felt that she was properly represented before we locked the picture. And I definitely wouldn't have applied that to the guys, but fortunately they also saw it, and whilst there's a lot that they're not proud of, that they're deeply ashamed of, they all agreed that it was very accurate, very honest to the experience of what happened. I don't tend to. I mean, where they physically are turning on a radio, or it of course should be a song from that time, but I tend to think more in terms of like the emotional content of what it, even more than the lyrics. I mean, and there are a lot. And when I'm writing, I'll listen to a lot of music, which often will spark an idea for like when they're on the way to the first robbery, and he turns on the radio, and this hip hop track starts booming, and it just came on when I went for a run. I was like, God, this is such an inappropriate song if you're trying to, keep your shit together on the way to a heist. And so that it was the song that actually sparked the idea of that, rather than the other way around. I guess I always tend to lean towards 60s and 70s sort of, because I think they have a permanence to those tracks, and they have and a lot of them are things that I will play on sets that because they feel like reflective of the energy of that sequence, and you want to keep the rhythm up. So it can be useful for the crew and the cast and everyone just have a sense of, oh right, so this is the energy of this sequence or this moment, and like, you know, that Doors track I fell in love with, and then it turned around that, you know, they turned around and like, it's $180,000 to use it, and I was like, fuck. And I tried 90 different tracks and couldn't, so I went cap in hand and said, please help me pay for this song. You know, so there are, and that's a real difficult thing when you fall in love with you know, the Elvis song, which is obviously a reflection, you know, a nod to Ocean's 11. I never wanted that in there, but it stuck so well, and again proved so difficult to, and it had that kind of gentleman gangster cheeky kind of fantasy sort of quality to it. But I didn't want to make such an overt nod to Ocean's 11, but the editors stuck it on, and then we were like, oh well, can't, you know. But it's more about the emotional content, and often you find a track which is really, it's about, you know, something really dark, but actually the energy of it does the opposite. It really gives you that emotional drive, which seems to mirror the scene. So that's more the process than anything. And the Rodriguez track at the end actually was just a nod to a friend of mine who, when I made my last film, a friend of mine made the Sugar Man film, and he unfortunately died. He didn't get to make his second film, and so that was just a little kind of nod to that more than, and also it's perfect for that moment, I guess. I mean, there's so much about it that was just absurd and just funny, and of course, you know, it is intentional. It's, you know, with the old man costumes, it was quite tricky because when we started playing, I mean, that is true. They did dress up as old men. They did put prosthetics on that. I didn't make that up. The challenging bit is how do you do that in a way where it's not so ridiculous that it's like a complete sort of, you know, you've inadvertently stepped into slaps. And when we were doing all of the kind of trying those costumes out, some of them were just, they'd come out and everyone would just fall about laughing, and it was like, all right, we've gone a little too far. So yeah, you know, for me, you know, that kind of comedy works best when it's really treading the line between tension and drama as well, and I think you get bigger laughs when you're on that, treading that. Similarly, often, you know, the tension can be heightened by sitting those things right up against each other. So, and you know, and there was a lot about the story and the kind of comedy of them pressing the button and opening, you know, that's always good, you know, and you want to play it as both shocking and like kind of head shaking and cringeworthy, but also kind of funny. And I love the idea that a lot of the scenes contain, you know, both comedy and stuff that's verging on being tragic. You know, like the scene at the end where he loses the plot in the car. You know, he's left his cell phone number. You know, but it's all true.